Guys like you don't matter, the man in the tailored suit said, his voice sharp, careless, echoing across the dim garage like it belonged there more than Ethan ever did. Ethan Cole didn't argue. He didn't look up. He just tightened the last bolt under the hood of a rusted pickup, his fingers stiff from 12 straight hours of work, oil soaked deep into his skin like it had nowhere else to go. It'll run, he said quietly. The man scoffed, tossed a crumpled 50 onto the workbench, and walked away without another word. 3 sentences. Quick. Cold. Final. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the concrete floor, over the scattered tools, over the man who never asked for respect, only the chance to earn it. Ethan exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as the silence settled back in. The garage smelled like motor oil and metal dust, like long nights and second chances that never quite came. He glanced at the small photo taped inside his toolbox. A little girl, maybe 7, her smile bright enough to outshine everything else in his world. Almost there, kiddo, he murmured under his breath. One more job. One more hour. One more push. That's how he had always lived. Quiet, steady, invisible. But the body doesn't negotiate forever. The next step he took wasn't steady. His vision blurred at the edges, the lights stretching into thin lines as the room tilted just slightly, then more. He reached for the workbench, missed by inches. The sound of a wrench hitting the floor rang louder than it should have. Then came the silence. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a quiet collapse, like a man folding into the weight he had carried too long. Footsteps passed. A car engine turned over. Someone laughed outside. Life continued, indifferent, uninterrupted. No one noticed the mechanic on the ground. No one stopped. No one asked. Until a different sound broke through, the soft, deliberate click of heels against concrete. Slow, measured, out of place in a world that had already decided what mattered and what didn't. Charlotte Hayes stepped into the garage, her black coat catching the faint light, her presence cutting through the noise like something that didn't belong to it. She wasn't supposed to come back. Not for the car. Not for him. And yet she stood there, eyes scanning the room, drawn to something she couldn't quite name. She saw the tools first, then the photo, then him, still, unmoving. For a moment, she didn't move either. Not out of fear, but recognition of something real, something quiet. Something the world had just stepped over without a second thought. And in that stillness, something inside her shifted. Because for the first time in a long time, the most powerful person in the room wasn't the one standing. It was the one no one had bothered to see. Charlotte Hayes did not gasp or panic, but she moved quickly, her composure sharpening into something purposeful as she stepped closer, her heels no longer echoing but urgent against the concrete. "Sir, can you hear me?" she said. Her voice steady but softer now, almost careful, as if respect had finally found its way into the room. There was no response, only the quiet rise and fall of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing. And for a moment, she simply looked at him, really. Looked, not at the worn jacket or the grease on his hands, but at the stillness that carried a kind of dignity she had not seen in years. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and spoke clearly. "I need medical assistance at Cole's Auto Garage on Westbrook Avenue." Immediately, her tone calm, precise, a voice used to being obeyed, but something beneath it trembled just enough to betray that this was different. She knelt beside him then, without hesitation, the cold concrete, pressing through her coat as her eyes caught the small photograph half tucked under his hand, and she gently freed it, careful, almost reverent, her gaze softening as she saw the little girl smiling back. Bright, trusting, unaware of the weight her father carried every single day. "You stayed for her," Charlotte whispered, not expecting an answer, her words hanging in the air like a quiet confession of her own understanding. Outside, a siren began to build in the distance, faint at first, then growing, but inside the garage, time seemed to slow, the buzzing lights, the ticking engine cooling nearby, the distant hum of passing traffic. All of it fading behind the stillness of that moment. She glanced around, noticing things she had missed before, a folded blanket in the corner, a coffee cup long gone cold, a stack of unpaid invoices tucked beneath a wrench, small details that told a story no one had bothered to read. "You should not have been alone in this," she murmured, her voice lower now, not to him, but to the silence itself. Footsteps approached from outside, someone calling out, "Is everything okay in here?" But Charlotte did not look up right away, her focus still on the man in front of her, on the quiet strength that had gone unseen for far too long. Then she answered, her voice firm again. "Help is on the way." 3 simple words. Steady, controlled, but carrying something deeper now, something that sounded a lot like responsibility. As the siren grew louder, filling the space that had once been indifferent, Charlotte Hayes remained beside Ethan Cole, not as a stranger, not as a customer, but as the only person who had chosen to stop, to see, to stay. And in that quiet, before the world rushed back in, something shifted, something neither of them had planned. Because sometimes, the first act of change is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply kneels down beside what the world ignored and refuses to walk away. The ambulance lights painted the garage walls in soft pulses of red and white, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat the room had forgotten it needed. And as the paramedics stepped in with quiet efficiency, their voices low and focused, Charlotte Hayes rose just enough to give them space, but did not step away, not fully, not yet. "How long has he been down?" one of them asked, kneeling beside Ethan, checking his pulse, his breathing, his condition, and Charlotte answered without hesitation, "Only a few minutes, I think." Though something in her voice carried more than time. It carried concern, real and unfiltered. They worked quickly, careful, respectful, lifting him onto the stretcher with practiced ease. And through it all, Ethan remained still, his face calm in a way that did not match the exhaustion written into every line of his body. "He is stable," the paramedic said, glancing up briefly. But he pushed himself too far, and Charlotte nodded once, absorbing the words as if they were meant for her as much as for them. Outside, the early morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain and distant traffic, and as they loaded him into the ambulance, Charlotte followed without asking, without explaining, simply stepping inside and taking the seat beside him like it had already been decided. The doors closed with a soft thud, sealing them into a quiet space where the noise of the world could not reach. And for the first time since she had walked into that garage, Charlotte allowed herself to breathe. She looked at him again, not as a mechanic, not as a stranger, but as a man whose silence spoke louder than anything she had heard in years. "You do not even know me," she said softly, more to herself than to him, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the stretcher, careful not to disturb, careful not to assume. "And still, you chose kindness." 3 words, simple, honest, unguarded. The ambulance moved steadily through the streets, the city beginning to wake around them, storefront lights flickering on, cars filling the roads, people stepping into another day without knowing what had just shifted in a quiet corner of it. Charlotte glanced down at the photograph still in her hand, the small smile of the little girl holding something fragile and powerful at the same time, and she wondered, not for the first time, what it meant to be needed, truly needed, not for money, not for status, not for control, but for something real. "Who are you, Ethan Cole?" she whispered, reading his name from the worn tag stitched into his jacket, the fabric faded but intact, like the man himself. The paramedic adjusted a monitor, the soft beeping steady and reassuring, and Charlotte leaned back slightly, her gaze never leaving him, her thoughts moving somewhere deeper than she had allowed in a long time. Because in a world where everything could be bought, managed, and controlled, she had just witnessed something that could not be priced, something that did not ask for recognition, something that simply existed in quiet dignity. And as the ambulance carried them forward, Charlotte Hayes realized something she had not planned, something she could not ignore, that this was no longer about a car, or a service, or even a moment. This was about a man the world had overlooked, and the undeniable truth that she could not walk away from him now, not after finally seeing what everyone else had missed. The hospital doors opened with a soft rush of air, and the world shifted again, from oil and concrete to polished floors in quiet urgency, where every sound carried purpose and every movement meant something. "We will take it from here," a nurse said gently, guiding the stretcher forward. But Charlotte Hayes did not follow the usual rules. She walked beside them, step for step, her presence calm but unwavering, as if leaving was no longer an option she recognized. They moved down a long hallway washed in pale light, past waiting rooms filled with tired faces and whispered conversations, until finally, the stretcher disappeared behind a set of swinging doors, and for the first time since the garage, she was forced to stop. 3 steps forward, then stillness. She stood there, hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture composed, but her eyes fixed on the doors that had just closed, as if something important had gone through them, and she had not yet decided whether to follow or to wait. "Ma'am, are you family?" the nurse asked, her tone polite but direct, and Charlotte hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because the truth did not fit into the question. "No," she said finally, her voice quiet, controlled, but he should not be alone, and something in the way she said it made the nurse pause, then nod. "You can wait right here," she replied, gesturing to a row of chairs along the wall. Charlotte sat, slowly, deliberately, as if sitting meant accepting something she had not planned. The minutes stretched, long and unmeasured, the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance marking time that felt different now, heavier, more deliberate. She glanced down at the photograph still in her hand, the edges slightly worn, the image simple but full of life, and she studied it again, not as a detail, but as a truth. "She trusts you," Charlotte whispered, her thumb brushing lightly over the surface. "And you never let that go." 2 sentences, soft, reflective, carrying more weight than they seemed. A doctor passed by, then another, footsteps echoing, voices low, and still she remained, unmoving, present. Across the room, a television played quietly, headlines scrolling, numbers rising, the kind of world she knew well, the kind of world she controlled. But here, none of it mattered. Here, there was only a man behind a door, and a choice she had already made without saying it out loud. After what felt like both seconds and hours, the doors opened again, and a nurse stepped out, scanning the hallway before her eyes landed on Charlotte. "He is awake," she said simply, and the words did not sound dramatic, but they changed everything. Charlotte stood immediately, no hesitation, no second thought, just movement. She followed the nurse down the hall, each step quieter than the last, until they reached a small room, the door slightly ajar, light spilling softly into the corridor. She paused there, just for a moment, her hand resting near the frame, her breath steady but deeper now, as if crossing that threshold meant stepping into something she could not undo. Then she pushed the door open gently, and there he was, Ethan Cole, sitting up slightly, eyes still heavy but open, aware, present. He looked at her, confusion flickering for a brief second before settling into something calmer, something observant. "You stayed," he said, his voice low, rough from exhaustion but steady. Charlotte stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the room holding a silence that did not feel empty, but full, like something waiting to be understood. Then she answered, her voice softer than before, but clearer than anything she had said all day. "Some things are worth staying for." And in that moment, the distance between who they were and what they represented did not disappear, but it shifted, just enough for something real to begin. "You should be resting," Charlotte said quietly, her voice carrying a calm that felt different now, less controlled, more human, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting briefly toward the window before returning to her, steady, observant. "I have rested enough," he replied. 3 words, simple, but layered with the kind of endurance that does not ask for sympathy. The room settled into a quiet rhythm, the soft hum of medical equipment, the distant footsteps in the hallway, the muted life of a place where people paused long enough to remember what mattered. Charlotte stepped a little closer, not invading, just present, her gaze moving from his face to the edge of the bed where his worn jacket had been folded, the same one she had seen on the garage floor, and she reached for it gently, almost instinctively, her fingers brushing the fabric as if it held answers. "You work too hard," she said, not as a judgment, but as an observation, and Ethan gave the smallest hint of a smile, one that did not fully form but did not disappear either. "Someone has to," he answered, his voice quiet but firm. 2 sentences, grounded, unembellished, carrying more truth than explanation. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, then placed the jacket back carefully. Her movements deliberate, respectful, as if she understood now that nothing about him was careless. "There are easier ways to live," she said, her tone softer, almost questioning, and Ethan shook his head slightly, his eyes steady on hers. "Not for me," he replied. The words were not defensive, they were certain, and in that certainty, something shifted again, something Charlotte could not ignore. She glanced down at the photograph still in her hand, then back at him, holding it up just enough for him to see. "She is your daughter," she said, and Ethan's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, the quiet strength softening at the edges, replaced by something warmer, something unguarded. "Her name is Lily," he said, his voice lower now, gentler, and for the first time, there was a hint of something beyond endurance, something like pride, something like love. Charlotte nodded slowly, absorbing the name, letting it settle. "She must be proud of you," she said, and Ethan looked away for a brief moment, not out of discomfort, but out of humility. "I just try to show up," he answered. 3 words, simple again, but heavier than most promises. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with understanding that did not need to be explained. Charlotte took a breath, deeper this time, as if she had reached a point she could not step back from, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something closer to honesty than control. "You helped me," she said, and Ethan frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "I fixed your car," he replied, and Charlotte shook her head, just once, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said softly. "You reminded me what matters," and the words did not sound like a revelation, but they landed like one. Ethan studied her for a moment, not impressed, not intimidated, just curious, as if he was trying to understand why someone like her would say something like that. And for the first time, Charlotte Hayes did not look like someone who had all the answers. She looked like someone who had just found the right question. Outside the room, the world continued, schedules, decisions, deals waiting to be made. But inside, something quieter held its ground, something that did not rush, did not demand, something that simply existed between two people who had nothing in common except the moment they now shared. And in that moment, the distance between them did not disappear, but it began to feel less like a barrier and more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Charlotte did not speak immediately, and neither did Ethan, because sometimes the most honest moments arrive without words, and the silence between them felt less like distance and more like understanding. She walked slowly toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass, the city beyond it moving in quiet layers, cars gliding past, people stepping into their routines, a world that never paused long enough to notice the small things that mattered most. "Do you ever stop?" she asked. Finally, her voice calm, but carrying something deeper now, something closer to concern than curiosity, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes following her for a moment before settling again. "Not really," he answered, 3 words, steady, unforced, like a truth he had accepted long ago. Charlotte turned slightly, her gaze returning to him. "Why?" she asked, and this time, there was no distance in the question, only quiet intention. Ethan looked down at his hands, the same hands that had carried weight no one had counted, and he spoke without hesitation. "Because she never gets a day off from needing me," he said, and in that moment, Lily was no longer just a photograph. She was the center of everything, the reason behind every long night, every sacrifice, every quiet decision. Charlotte nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, letting it settle deeper than logic, deeper than strategy, somewhere closer to meaning. She took a step back toward him, her movements slower now, more grounded, as if the space between them had changed. "There are people who could help you," she said, her tone careful, not offering, not imposing, just stating something that had always been true in her world. Ethan gave a small shake of his head, not dismissive, just certain. "Help is not always free," he replied, and Charlotte paused, just for a second, because she understood exactly what he meant. 2 sentences, simple, but heavy with experience. She lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back at him, her expression softer than before, less guarded. "What if it was?" she asked, and Ethan met her eyes, not skeptical, not hopeful, just steady. Nothing is, he said. The room grew quiet again, but this time, the silence carried a different weight, not distance, but reflection. Charlotte stepped closer to the bed, close enough now that the line between who they were and what they represented felt thinner, almost fragile. You think I am offering something you cannot trust, she said, her voice low, even, and Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply watched her, as if measuring not her words, but the truth behind them. Then he spoke, calm and direct. I think you are not used to being told no. 3 sentences, clean, precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Charlotte held his gaze, and for a moment, something almost like a smile touched the edge of her expression, not amused, but recognizing something real. You are right, she admitted quietly, and there was no pride in it, no defense, just honesty. She glanced down at the photograph once more, then placed it gently on the small table beside him, her fingers lingering for a brief second before pulling back. But I am learning, she added, and those 3 words did not sound like a statement, they sounded like a beginning. Outside the room, the hospital continued its steady rhythm, footsteps, voices, life moving forward. But inside, something slower was unfolding, something that did not rush, did not force, something that waited. And as Charlotte Hayes stood there, no longer just a stranger, and Ethan Cole met her without fear or expectation, the space between them held a quiet truth, that sometimes the strongest connection does not come from power or need, but from the rare moment when 2 people choose to understand each other without trying to change what they see. The room held its quiet, but something beneath it had changed, something subtle, like the shift in air before a storm that never comes, only transforms. Charlotte Hayes stood still for a moment longer, then reached into her coat and placed her phone gently on the table, screen lighting up with a single contact name. And she turned it toward Ethan, not as a display of power, but as a gesture of transparency. If you need anything, she said, her voice even, measured, you call this number. And Ethan glanced at the screen, then back at her, his expression unreadable, not impressed, not dismissive, just grounded. Why? He asked. One word, quiet, but direct. Charlotte did not hesitate this time. Because I trust you, she answered. 3 words, simple, but carrying a weight that did not come easily from someone like her. Ethan studied her for a moment, longer than before, as if measuring not the offer, but the intent behind it, and then he looked away slightly, his gaze settling on the photograph again. Trust is earned, he said, calm, steady, not challenging, just stating what had always been true in his world. Charlotte nodded once, accepting the boundary without resistance. Then let me earn it, she replied, her tone softer now, but certain. The words did not push, they stayed, like something willing to wait. A nurse knocked lightly on the door and stepped inside, her smile polite but purposeful. Mr. Cole, we are going to run a few more tests, just to be safe, she said, and Ethan gave a small nod. All right, he answered, simple, cooperative, as he began to shift slightly, preparing to follow instructions without complaint. Charlotte stepped back just enough to give space, but she did not leave, not yet. The nurse glanced at her briefly, then back at Ethan. Family can wait outside, she added gently. And again, the question hung in the air without being asked directly. Charlotte paused, just for a second, then turned toward the door, her movements composed, but slower than before, as if leaving now required more thought than arriving ever did. She reached the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame, and for a brief moment, she looked back. Ethan met her gaze, steady as always, no expectation, no request, just presence. You should go, he said, quietly, not pushing her away, but giving her the choice she had not had to make before. Charlotte held that moment, her eyes reflecting something deeper than certainty, something closer to decision, and then she nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. I will be back, she said, her voice calm, but carrying something new, something that did not need to prove itself. 3 words, simple, but intentional. Ethan did not respond immediately, he simply watched her, and after a second, he gave a small nod of his own, not as permission, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. Charlotte stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her, and as she walked away, the world began to return, the sounds, the movement, the expectations waiting for her outside that quiet room. But something had shifted, something she could not ignore, because for the first time in a long time, she was not walking toward control, she was walking back to something she had chosen, and inside the room, as the nurse prepared for the next steps, Ethan Cole rested back against the pillow, his eyes closing briefly, not from exhaustion alone, but from the quiet realization that sometimes, the most unexpected moments do not change your life all at once. They simply introduce you to someone who might. The hallway swallowed Charlotte Hayes as the door closed behind her. But for the first time, the world she stepped back into did not feel the same. The polished floors, the quiet conversations, the distant ringing phones, all of it familiar, all of it controlled. And yet something in her had shifted beyond control. Ms. Hayes. A voice called from behind, sharp, efficient, and she turned to see a man in a dark suit approaching quickly. Tablet in hand, eyes focused. Your 9 o'clock meeting has been moved up, and the board is waiting. 3 sentences, precise, urgent, the language of a life that never paused. Charlotte looked at him, really looked, as if seeing something she had seen 1,000 times before but never questioned. And for a moment, she said nothing. Reschedule it. She replied finally, her voice calm, but different now, less reactive, more intentional. The man blinked, caught slightly off guard. Ma'am, this is not a meeting we can delay, he said, and Charlotte held his gaze, steady, unshaken. It is now, she answered. 3 words, quiet, but final. The man nodded slowly, adjusting his stance, recalibrating. Of course, he said, stepping back, already typing, already adapting to a decision he did not fully understand. Charlotte turned away, her steps slower now, more deliberate, not rushing back into the world that had always demanded her attention, but moving through it with a different awareness. She passed by glass walls and private offices, people glancing up, recognizing her, lowering their voices, adjusting their posture. But she did not stop, not for greetings, not for acknowledgement. Her mind was not there. It was still in that small hospital room, still with the man who had nothing and yet carried something she had not found in years. She reached the elevator and pressed the button, the soft chime echoing as the door slid open. And as she stepped inside, her reflection met her in the mirrored walls. Composed, controlled, unchanged on the surface. But her eyes held something new, something quieter, something searching. The elevator descended smoothly, floor by floor, the city waiting below, the responsibilities, the expectations, the life she had built with precision and discipline. And yet, as the doors opened to the lobby, she did not step forward immediately. 3 seconds passed, then 5, then a quiet breath. She reached into her coat and pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen before making a decision that did not require approval, did not require explanation. She selected a contact, then another, her voice calm as she spoke. Cancel the rest of my schedule today, she said, and the voice on the other end hesitated, then responded, understood. Charlotte ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, the decision already made, the path already chosen. Outside, the air carried the warmth of late morning, the city alive with motion, cars passing, people moving, a world that measured value in speed and visibility. But Charlotte Hayes stepped into it differently now, not as someone being pulled forward, but as someone walking back towards something she had chosen to see. Across town, in a quiet hospital room, Ethan Cole sat in stillness as the nurse finished her checks, the machine steady, the room calm, and when she stepped out, leaving him alone again, he reached for the photograph beside him, his fingers resting lightly against it. Grounding, familiar. He glanced toward the door, not expecting, not assuming, just aware, because something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. And in that quiet space between what had happened and what might come next, both of them moved through their worlds differently, guided not by habit, but by a moment that refused to be forgotten. The hospital room had grown quieter, the kind of quiet that does not press down, but settles gently, like something waiting to be understood. And Ethan Cole sat with the photograph in his hand, his thumb tracing the edge without thinking, his eyes steady but distant, as if he was listening to something beyond the room. The door opened softly, not rushed, not announced, just present, and Charlotte Hayes stepped back inside, her movements calm, her expression composed, but different now, less guarded, more certain. "You came back," Ethan said, his voice low. Not surprised, not questioning, just acknowledging what was already true. Charlotte closed the door behind her and took a few steps forward, stopping at a distance that felt respectful, not distant. "I said I would," she replied. 3 words, simple, but carrying a quiet weight that did not need to prove itself. The room held still again, but this time, the silence felt shared. Charlotte glanced at the chair beside the bed, then sat down slowly, her posture relaxed in a way that did not belong to boardrooms or meetings, but to something more human, more present. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her tone steady, not out of obligation, but genuine interest. Ethan leaned back slightly, considering the question. "Better," he said, then after a pause, "Enough." And the difference between those 2 words lingered in the air. Charlotte nodded, understanding more than he explained, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because sometimes clarity does not come from more words, it comes from fewer. Then Charlotte took a breath, deeper this time, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something closer to truth than intention. "I was not honest with you," she said, and Ethan looked at her, not tense, not defensive, just attentive. "The garage," she continued, her gaze steady. "It is part of my company." 3 sentences, measured, direct, and for a brief moment, the space between them shifted again, not breaking, but revealing. Ethan did not react immediately. He simply held her gaze, processing, not surprised, not impressed, just understanding something that had already been there beneath the surface. "That makes sense," he said quietly, and there was no edge in his voice, no change in tone, just acceptance. Charlotte watched him closely, searching for something, a reaction, a distance, a difference, but it did not come. Instead, he remained exactly who he had been, steady, grounded, unchanged, and in that, something inside her settled. "I do not want to fix your life," she said, her voice softer now, more careful. "And I do not want to buy your trust." And the words were not rehearsed, they were chosen. Ethan listened, his expression calm, giving her space to continue. "But I meant what I said," she added, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "I need you." 3 words, simple, but different now, not from power, not from position, but from recognition. The room grew still again, the kind of stillness that does not rush for answers, that allows truth to land where it belongs. Ethan looked at her, really looked, as if weighing not the words, but the meaning behind them, and then he spoke, slowly, deliberately. "You do not need me," he said, and Charlotte's breath caught just slightly, not from offense, but from the honesty she had come to expect. He continued, his voice calm, unwavering. "But you chose to come back." And that sentence did not dismiss her, it met her where she stood. Charlotte held his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them moved, because something had already been said without needing to be repeated. And in that quiet space, where nothing needed to be proven, where nothing needed to be forced, the truth settled gently between them, that sometimes, what matters most is not who has power, or who has nothing, but who chooses to stay when they could have walked away. And as the light from the window softened across the room, neither of them spoke. Because for the first time, the silence did not separate them, it held them in the same place.